The air in the command cave was thick and cold, a damp chill that seeped into the bones. It was a stark contrast to the tropical heat outside, a constant, clammy reminder that they were buried alive in the heart of the mountain. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito stood motionless before the large terrain model of Saipan, a meticulously crafted landscape of carved coral and tiny flags. His chief of staff, Colonel Takashi, had just finished the latest readiness report. The numbers were good. Morale was high, and Saito felt a profound, unshakable dread. He dismissed the colonel with a quiet nod. Only when they were alone did he allow his posture to slacken, just for a moment. His fingers found the worn, dog-eared photograph in his tunic pocket. It was a simple family portrait, taken in a Tokyo studio a lifetime ago. His wife, Kimiko, smiled with a gentle warmth that could almost melt the ice in his heart. His son, Kenji, stood tall and proud, trying to look like the soldier his father was. His daughter, little Aiko, clutched a doll, her eyes wide with innocence. They were safe for now, in a city that was slowly being starved and bombed into submission. Every day, his command here was a race against the American bombers that threatened his home. He was not just defending an island, he was buying time for his family, 1,000 miles away. The rustle of the canvas curtain broke his reverie. Captain Tanaka, his young aide, entered. The captain's uniform, once crisp, was now as worn as the man himself. Saito noted the subtle, involuntary tremor in Tanaka's hand as he saluted, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow that wasn't just from the humidity. The boy was fighting malaria, or perhaps just the relentless pressure. He was not a blind zealot. He was a dedicated, exhausted soldier clinging to duty. That made him far more reliable, and his potential loss far more tragic. "The latest reconnaissance, General," Tanaka said, his voice hoarse. He pointed to the terrain model with a baton. "The American fleet continues to gather here, to the northwest. Their pattern is consistent. All intelligence confirms it. They will land here, at Charan Kanoa and Agingen Point. The beaches are perfect for their doctrine. They will come like a tsunami, General. Predictable, but overwhelming." Saito nodded slowly, his eyes tracing the coastline. He had studied the Americans in China, had read their manuals, had dissected their every move at Tarawa and Makin. They were creatures of process, slaves to their own logistical brilliance. They believed that any problem could be solved with enough shells and steel. "They will not be pushed back into the sea, Tanaka," Saito stated, his voice a low, flat monotone that brooked no argument. "To believe that is to believe in a child's story. Their naval gunfire will shatter everything on the surface. Their air power will dominate the sky. We cannot stop the wave from crashing ashore." Tanaka's confident expression fractured, confusion and a flicker of fear in its place. Then, "Our victory? How do we achieve victory if we cannot stop them?" Saito's lips tightened into a grim, bloodless line. He moved his hand from the beach, his fingers walking inland over the ridges, the ravines, the dense jungle. "Victory is not a point on a map, Captain. It is a state of mind. We will let them land. We will let them pour their men and machines onto this island. We will let them believe they have won their precious beachhead. And then," his hand clenched into a fist, hovering over the island's interior, "we will make every meter of this island a testament to their folly." He picked up a small carved block representing a Marine battalion and advanced it inland. "We have spent 6 months turning this island into a sponge that will soak up American blood. We will draw them into the ridges, into the gullies. Every cave is a fortress. Every ravine is a killing zone. We will force them to fight for 10 days for a hill that is worth nothing. We will make the cost so horrific, so unbearably high, that the mothers in Chicago and the factory workers in Detroit will scream for it to end. We are not just defending an island, Tanaka. We are breaking the will of a nation." This was the cold, brutal genius of his defense. A war of psychological attrition fought with physical sacrifice. He would trade Japanese lives for American resolve, and he believed it was a trade he would win. "But their fleet," Tanaka persisted, his voice barely a whisper, voicing the terror that haunted every man in the garrison. They are a floating city of supplies. They can shell us for a year. They can sustain this forever. For the first time, a true, chilling smile touched Saito's lips. It was a terrifying sight, the smile of a man who has seen the final move in a chess game. "Their fleet is the key to their destruction, Captain," Saito said, leaning closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Admiral Kakuta has assembled the first air fleet in Tinian, hundreds of aircraft. They are not to be wasted on the landing craft. No, that would be a fool's errand." He swept his hand over the blue cloth representing the ocean around Saipan. "They will wait. They will let the American armada settle into position. They will let the carriers and battleships become complacent, focused entirely on bombarding our positions and supporting their men ashore. They will become stationary, predictable. And then—" He slammed his open palm onto the table, making the tiny models of American ships jump and clatter. "When the time is perfect, when their guard is down, the eagles will strike from the sun. They will sink the carriers. They will sink the battleships. They will sever the head from the body. The Marines on this island will be stranded, trapped in the fortress they thought they had conquered. No air cover, no naval support, no supplies. They will wither and die under our guns." The full, horrifying scope of the plan was laid bare. It was a masterpiece of strategic depth and ruthless patience, a trap within a trap. He had accounted for American power, American doctrine, and American technology. He had built an unbreachable fortress, not just of coral and concrete, but of logic, foresight, and sacrifice. He walked to the cave entrance, looking out at the deceptively calm, sun-drenched Pacific horizon. He was ready for the American war machine. He was ready for their courage, their numbers, their bombs. But in his meticulous planning, he had dismissed one component of the American machine as insignificant. He had not accounted for the mechanics, the repairmen, the floating dry docks. He saw them as support elements, non-combatants. He did not see them as the linchpin that could hold his entire brilliant trap together, or tear it irreparably apart. The world of the forward repair base was a special kind of hell, a stark contrast to the pristine blue of the open ocean. Here, the water was a foul, churning stew of fuel oil, chemical slicks, and garbage, perpetually shadowed by the hulking gray forms of 100 ships. The air was a constant, deafening roar, a symphony of groaning metal, screaming power tools, and the deep-throated thrum of diesel generators. This was the tale of the American beast, a place of grease, sweat, and brutal pragmatism, far from the heroic headlines generated on the beaches. On the floating dry dock ABS-7, Chief Engineer Sam McAllister wiped a greasy forearm across his brow, leaving a new smear of grime on his already filthy face. The ABS-7 was a monstrous, ungainly thing, a U-shaped vessel of immense strength and zero grace. Its purpose was simple: to sink itself, swallow a wounded ship, and then lift it out of the water for surgery. It was a floating, mobile shipyard, and its crew were the surgeons. McAllister's operating theater was the massive open caisson, currently holding the gutted engine of a landing craft infantry ship. The smell of welding ozone, hot metal, and seawater was overpowering. "Johnson, I told you to check the torque on those main bearings. This isn't a suggestion, it's a fact. If that shaft seizes at flank speed, 50 men go swimming." McAllister's voice was a permanent roar, honed by years of shouting over industrial noise. He was a man built of compact muscle and simmering frustration, his eyes constantly scanning, diagnosing, criticizing. He loved his machines with a purity he reserved for nothing else, because machines were logical. They broke for a reason, and they could be fixed. The same could not be said for the world. 1,000 yards away, the massive floating crane Hercules performed a ballet of brute force. Its operator, Petty Officer Maria Flores, guided a 5-ton gun barrel through a labyrinth of antennae and rigging with the delicate touch of a watchmaker. Her world was the glass-walled cab, high above the fray, a sanctuary of relative quiet filled with the hum of hydraulics and the crackle of the radio. Below her, men looked like ants, their lives dependent on her steady hands. She was 24 years old, a Latina from Los Angeles who had learned mechanics from her father in his auto shop. Here, her skills kept a fleet afloat. She never thought of herself as a hero. She was just a very, very good mechanic with an unparalleled view. And then there was the repair ship, Hephaestus. If the ABS-7 was the operating room, and the Hercules the skilled hands, the Hephaestus was the hospital's entire manufacturing wing. Inside its labyrinthine workshops, men labored in a Stygian atmosphere of flying sparks and screaming lathes. They could forge a piston, rewind a generator, or fabricate a complex valve assembly from a block of steel. Its commander, Captain John Wright, was a quiet, meticulous man who saw the war not as a series of battles, but as a vast logistical equation. In his office, surrounded by schematics and supply manifests, he calculated the flow of spare parts and skilled labor. He knew that the side that could most efficiently repair its damage, closer to the fight, held a strategic advantage that no single weapon could match. The three vessels, the dock, the crane, the workshop, formed an unbreakable symbiotic triangle. They were the unheroic, indispensable foundation upon which the entire American advance was built. They were the reason the fleet could sustain itself thousands of miles from home. The crackling, urgent voice that erupted from the radio on McAllister's hip was not part of the usual noise. It was the task force commander, and his tone cut through the industrial din like a knife. "McAllister, Wright, listen up. The Japs are throwing everything they have at the screening force. The destroyer Johnston took a direct hit from a dive bomber near her stern. Her steering is gone. Her screws are damaged. She's dead in the water and listing. The Japs have her scent. She'll be under another air attack within the hour. We're trying to get tugs to her now." The message hung in the oily air, silencing the immediate work around McAllister. A destroyer, over 300 men, a floating coffin. "The tugs will bring her to you," the commander continued, the strain evident in every word. "She needs a rudder patch, emergency power to her steering, and enough hull integrity to make 5 knots. You have 1 hour, maybe less. If you can't fix her, we have to scuttle her to prevent her capture. And we lose her crew." McAllister's mind instantly began calculating, visualizing the Johnston schematics. It was a 2-day job, minimum. Flooding the dry dock alone took 20 minutes. Positioning the ship, another 20. Pumping it out, 20 more. That left them with precisely 0 minutes to do the actual work. He keyed his radio, his voice a low, gravelly growl. "You're asking for a miracle. We'll need a diversion, air cover. Keep those bastards off our backs." "Negative, Chief," the voice came back, final and grim. "Every fighter we have is tied up protecting the carriers from the main strike group. You are on your own. You have 1 hour. Command out." The line went dead. On the bridge of the Hephaestus, Captain Wright met McAllister's gaze across the water. No words were exchanged. They were both engineers. They both knew the numbers. The equation was impossible. McAllister turned to his crew. Their faces, young and old, were smeared with grime, their eyes wide, looking to him not for a patriotic speech, but for a solution. He was not a leader of men, he was a master of machines, and now he had to make his men into a machine. "All right, you heard him," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "We're not losing that ship. We are not losing those men. Flood the dock, now. I want every welder, every pipe fitter, every electrician suited up and on the line the second that hull is clear. This isn't a repair job anymore. This is a rescue. Now move." The unheroic foundation of the American war machine roared into a new, desperate rhythm. The real battle for the fleet had just shifted from the sky to this oily, chaotic patch of water against a ticking clock that was counting down to a tragedy. The shriek of metal being torn and rebuilt inside the drained caisson of ABS-7 was a physical force, a wall of sound that pummeled the senses. The wounded destroyer Johnston sat cradled in the steel embrace of the dock, its shattered stern a grotesque sculpture of twisted plating and exposed machinery. The air was unbreathable, a thick fog of acrid smoke from welding torches, blasting steam from leaking pipes, and the distinct coppery scent of fear that sweat alone could not produce. Chief McAllister moved through the chaos like a predator, his eyes missing nothing. He was no longer just a man. He was the central processor of a desperate system. "Harris, that patch plate is 2 inches out of alignment. Do you want to hand the Japs a perfect target? Fix it. Flores, I need lateral support on the port side now. The hull is buckling." His voice was a battering ram, driving his crew forward through sheer force of will. High above in the Hercules's glass cab, Maria Flores was a study in controlled terror. She was playing a lethal game of operation, her entire world reduced to the view through her window and the constant frantic chatter on the radio. She was maneuvering a 3-ton steel patch plate through a nightmare jungle of jagged, torn metal, swaying cables, and the tiny, vulnerable figures of the welders below. A single tremor in her hand, a misjudgment of a few centimeters, would mean a severed hydraulic line, a crushed man, a catastrophic failure. Her palms were slick with sweat inside her gloves, her jaw clenched so tight it ached. Every gentle, precise movement of the controls was a prayer. On the Hephaestus, Captain Wright's world was one of organized frenzy. His machine shops had become a production line for miracles. Teams worked from hand-sketched diagrams, still damp with seawater, fabricating a custom hydraulic line, machining a sheared valve assembly from a solid block of brass. The blueprints were irrelevant. They were working from the brutal reality of the damage reports shouted over the radio. This wasn't engineering. It was battlefield triage with lathes and forges. Then, the world ended. The first warning was a thin, high-pitched whistle that grew to a scream, abruptly terminated by a colossal crump that slammed into the men like a physical blow. A towering geyser of white water erupted just off the dry dock's port side, drenching everyone on that side. The Japanese coastal battery on Saipan, silent until now, had finally found their range. The ABS-7 was a stationary, undefended target, and they were zeroing in. "Incoming! Everyone down!" McAllister roared, but his order was a formality. His crew didn't stop. They flinched, they dove for cover behind steel stanchions, but their tools kept working. A veteran welder named Petrovsky, a man who had worked in the shipyards of Baltimore since he was 14, didn't even look up. His arc torch continued to spit its brilliant, blinding blue light, fusing steel to steel. He was in his own world, a universe of seam and penetration, and a little thing like artillery was an unwelcome distraction. Another shell landed, closer this time. The shockwave rattled teeth and sent tools skittering across the deck. The ABS-7 shuddered violently, groaning in protest. On the deck of the Johnston, the young sailor they had seen earlier, the one desperately trying to save his buddy, stared in abject horror. But his terror was not focused on the incoming shells. It was fixed on the repair crews who, against all instinct, refused to abandon them. Captain Wright's voice was a calm, strained anchor in the storm of noise. "Sam, they're walking them in. That was a bracket. The next salvo is for impact. We have maybe 90 seconds. McAllister's mind, a cold engine of logic, processed the variables. To flood the dock and attempt to move would take 20 minutes they did not have, and it would be a death sentence for the Johnston. To order his men to abandon their posts and take cover was the sane, human thing to do. But it would mean failing the mission. It would mean condemning the Johnston's crew. He was trapped in a calculus of salvation where the variables were human lives. He made the call. It was the most difficult order of his life. "Everyone stay on the job. Flores, you hold that plate steady if the whole damn island falls on us. Right, I need that hydraulic line now, not in 5 minutes. Now!" It was an act of monstrous responsibility. He was gambling the lives of his own crew to save the lives of another. The Japanese gunners, professionals to the last, made their final correction. The third salvo was not a near miss. The shell, a 150mm high explosive round, screamed in from the island and struck the starboard wing wall of the ABS-7 with the sound of the world tearing apart. The concussion blew men off their feet. A fireball, orange and black, rolled into the sky, swallowing a section of the dock. Steel plates, once solid, were peeled back like paper. The lights flickered, died, and then emergency battle lamps flickered on, casting long, dancing shadows in a scene from hell. The air was filled with the moans of the wounded and the terrifying hiss of severed steam lines. For a heart-stopping second, there was a vacuum of silence, a collective gasp of shock and pain. Then, a single voice, raw and defiant, cut through the darkness. It was Petrovsky. He had been thrown back by the blast, but he had shielded his welding rig with his own body. Now, In the eerie, smoky gloom, he struck his arc again. The sudden, fierce blue light was a beacon, a declaration of war. "Light 'em up, you lazy bums," he roared, his voice cracking with emotion and effort. "We ain't finished. My grandmother could weld better in a blackout. Let's go." One by one, other welding torches flared to life. Men staggered to their feet, checking on their buddies, then grabbing their tools. They were bloody. They were terrified, but they were not beaten. McAllister, a deep gash on his forehead bleeding into his eye, saw his crew not as individuals, but as a single, unbreakable organism. On the Hercules, Maria Flores's ears were ringing, her head throbbing from the impact. She looked down, and her blood ran cold. The blast had shifted the Johnston's stern by several critical inches. All her careful calculations, the angles, the clearances, were now useless. The problem had just changed. "Chief," she radioed, her voice trembling but clear, fighting through the panic. "The target moved. The whole damn ship moved. I need a new solution. Give me 30 seconds. She wiped her eyes, took a deep, shuddering breath, and recalculated. Wind, swing, drop, the new angle of the hull. Her mind, trained for precision, processed the new, lethal variables under fire. She was no longer just moving a part. She was recomposing a symphony of motion in the middle of an earthquake. With a whispered prayer to her father, she committed. The Hercules's motors whined in protest, and the massive steel plate began its slow, perilous journey again, inching toward its moving target with agonizing, impossible precision. They had survived the direct hit, but the clock was still ticking. The wounded were screaming, and the Japanese gunners, confident now, were reloading for the kill. The calculus of salvation had become a brutal, bloody equation, and the final sum was still unknown. The world had shrunk to a single, terrifying point in space, the gap between the Hercules's massive crane hook and the Johnston's mangled stern. Inside her glass-walled cab, suspended high above the chaos, Maria Flores's universe consisted of three things: the swinging 3-ton steel patch plate, the screaming radio in her ear, and the tiny, vulnerable figures below who trusted her with their lives. Her hands, slick with sweat inside leather gloves, made constant micro-adjustments to the controls, her breathing shallow and controlled. The patch plate swung like a pendulum of doom, now just 18 inches from its target. "Wind's shifting, Chief," she reported, her voice tight but professional. "Port side gusting to 15 knots. The Johnston is rolling about 5 degrees to starboard with the swell." Below, Chief McAllister stood ankle-deep in oily water that sloshed through the drained, dry dock, his head tilted back at an unnatural angle, never taking his eyes off the massive plate swaying above them. He had teams positioned with guide ropes on both sides, but everyone knew this was Maria's dance alone. One wrong move and the plate would swing out of control, crushing equipment or men. "Easy now, Flores." McAllister's voice crackled in her headset, calm but urgent. "You're fighting both the wind and the ship's roll. Wait for the downswing. Feel the rhythm. Steady. Steady. Now. Bring her home." The plate made contact with a deep, resonant clang that vibrated through the entire dry dock structure, a sound so profound it felt like a physical blow. It was the most beautiful, most relieving sound any of them had heard in weeks. Before the echo died, teams of welders surged forward from their covered positions, their torches flaring to life simultaneously, stitching the steel skin onto the destroyer's wound in a spectacular shower of brilliant orange sparks. Petrovsky, his face a grotesque mask of soot and determination beneath his welding helmet, led the charge like a man possessed. "Let's go, you beautiful bastards. This ain't a beauty contest. I want deep penetration. Miller, watch your heat. Too hot and you'll warp the plate. Johnson, keep that arc steady. I want that seam fused like it was born there, not welded." For 10 glorious minutes, it seemed like they might actually pull off the impossible. The patch was seating perfectly. Then the radio call came that shattered their fragile hope. "Sam, we've got a bigger problem." It was Captain Wright from the Hephaestus, his usual unflappable calm completely shattered. The shock from that shell impact, it sheared the main hydraulic control rod inside the steering compartment. It's a solid forged billet of high-tensile steel, 3 feet long, 2 inches thick, snapped clean in two like a twig. We don't have a spare, and there aren't any within 1,000 miles. Without it, the rudder is useless. They can't steer. McAllister felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach, a sensation of dread so profound it nearly buckled his knees. They could patch the hull 100 times. They could replace every plate. But without that specific rod connecting the bridge's steering wheel to the rudder mechanism far below, the Johnston was still a dead ship, a floating coffin waiting for the next Japanese bomb or torpedo. "How long to make a new one?" McAllister barked into his radio, already dreading the answer he knew was coming. "On our equipment, with proper heat treatment and precision machining to the exact tolerances needed?" Wright's voice was grim. 8 hours, minimum. We'd have to forge a new billet from raw stock, normalize it in the furnace, machine it to within thousandths of an inch, heat treat it for strength. "We have less than 30 minutes, McAllister roared, slamming his fist against a bulkhead hard enough to leave a dent in the steel. "The Japs are reforming for another strike right now. There has to be another way. Think, John. There's always another way." A tense, heavy silence filled the radio channel, broken only by the background whir of Hephaestus's machine shops and the frantic shouting of men. McAllister's mind raced, scanning through decades of mechanical experience, through every repair manual he'd ever memorized, every trick he'd learned in shipyards from Brooklyn to Pearl Harbor. He came up empty. They were so close. To fail now, because of one broken rod, one single point of failure. Then, a new, younger voice, hesitant but clear, cut through the static. It was machinist's mate 3rd class Danny O'Malley, a fresh-faced kid from a farm outside Cedar Rapids, who'd joined the Navy to see the world beyond Iowa's cornfields. "Chief, Captain, what if we don't make a new one? What if we fix the old one?" "It's in 2 pieces, O'Malley," McAllister snapped, his patience completely gone. "We can't wish it back together. This isn't one of your tractors." "No, sir, listen," O'Malley pressed, his voice gaining confidence and speed. "We can sleeve it. We take a heavier gauge steel tube, bore it out to a press fit over the broken ends, and weld the whole assembly into one solid unit. We'll preheat the whole assembly to 500 degrees, use high nickel rod for the weld. It'll be stronger than the original where it counts. It's a field expedient repair, sure, but it'll work. I've done it on combine axles back home when we couldn't wait 3 weeks for parts from Chicago." McAllister and Wright, separated by water but united in desperation, exchanged a look across the radio waves, the audacious idea hanging between them. It was unorthodox. It violated every engineering manual the Navy had ever published. It was exactly the kind of brilliant, desperate improvisation that won wars when textbook solutions failed. "Do it," both men said in near unison, the decision made in a heartbeat. On the Hephaestus, a new kind of frenzy began. The 2 broken pieces of the critical rod were rushed into the main machine shop as if they were carrying the Holy Grail. O'Malley, suddenly transformed from a junior machinist to the man in charge, moved with frantic energy. "This one!" he yelled, pulling a length of hardened nickel-steel tubing from a rack. 3-inch diameter, 1/4-inch wall. Chuck it up. We need a bore of 2.005 inches plus or minus nothing. We get one shot at this. Move!" Lathes screamed to life, their bits biting into the tough steel with showers of bright yellow sparks. The air filled with the smell of hot metal, cutting oil, and pure desperation. Captain Wright personally oversaw the operation, his pocket watch in his hand, his face pale. He knew they were racing against more than just the clock. They were racing against the entire Japanese air arm. Back on the Johnston, another desperate drama unfolded simultaneously. As the welders finished the hull patch, a damage control team led by Chief Reynolds, the Johnston's senior engineer, descended into the flooded, pitch-black steering compartment. The water was chest-deep, swirling with oil, debris, and the distinct coppery scent of seawater mixed with blood. "All right, listen up," Reynolds yelled, his voice echoing strangely in the cramped, dark space. "We need to manually align the rudder quadrant before that rod gets here. Peterson, get on that 3-foot wrench. Simmons, you're on the indicator. Jenkins, get that flashlight aimed properly. We need the quadrant at 2 degrees starboard exactly. Not 1 degree, not 3. 2. We get one shot at this when that rod goes in." They worked completely blind, by feel and shouted instruction in the oppressive darkness, their hands numb from the cold water, their bodies aching with fatigue and tension. The fate of their ship, of their 300 shipmates, rested on their ability to align tons of machinery by hand in complete darkness. The radio crackled again with the voice they'd all been dreading. It was the task force commander, his voice stripped of all emotion, delivering the ultimatum they knew was coming. ABS-7, Hercules, be advised. Japanese air patrols are reforming. Radar shows bogies vectoring in your direction. Estimated time of arrival, 15 minutes. You are out of time. Get that ship moving or scuttle her. That is a direct order. We cannot risk her capture. The ultimatum landed like a physical blow across all 3 ships. 15 minutes. They were so close they could taste it. Just then, a small launch sped away from the Hephaestus, cutting through the choppy water at full throttle, throwing up a white wake of pure urgency. Standing in the bow, balancing precariously, holding the repaired, still-warm control rod wrapped in clean rags like a sacred relic, was Danny O'Malley. He had insisted on delivering it himself. "Faster!" he yelled at the coxswain over the wind and engine roar. "They're gonna scuttle her. They'll do it." The launch slammed against the Johnston's hull with a jarring impact. The rod was passed up carefully, hand over hand by a human chain of sailors, and rushed into the bowels of the ship as if carrying the last hope of salvation. In the nightmarish steering compartment, Chief Reynolds's team sloshed through the oily water to receive it. They slammed the sleeved rod into place. A welder, lying on his back in the filthy water, ignited his torch with a sharp hiss. The sudden, brilliant blue-white light illuminated the determined, grimy faces of the sailors, holding the heavy assembly steady against tremendous pressure. Sparks rained down in a spectacular shower, sizzling and popping as they hit the water around them. It was the final, most critical weld of their lives. On the bridge of the Johnston, the captain stood with his white-knuckled hand on the engine telegraph, his eyes locked on the rudder position indicator, as if he could make it move by sheer force of will. The silence in the pilot house was so thick it felt suffocating. The helmsman stood ready at the useless wheel, every man holding his breath. A tense minute passed, then another. The only sound was the gentle lapping of water against the hull and the distant, ever-present hum of the fleet around them. Suddenly, the needle on the rudder position indicator twitched. Then it moved freely, smoothly, responding to the emergency helm controls. "We have steering!" Chief Reynolds's voice yelled from the intercom, raw with emotion and relief. "Repeat! We have steering! It's holding! Pressure is nominal!" A ragged, exhausted cheer went up across the ABS-7, the Hercules, and the Johnston, not of triumph, but of sheer, overwhelming relief and disbelief. Men hugged each other, some openly wept, others simply collapsed where they stood, the tension finally releasing. McAllister keyed his radio, his own hand trembling slightly for the first time anyone could remember. "ABS-7 to command. The Johnston is mobile. Repeat, the Johnston is mobile. We are pumping out the dock now. She'll be ready for tow in 5 minutes." The response was immediate, the relief audible even through the radio static. "Acknowledged, ABS-7. Tugs are standing by to take her under tow. Get her out of there. And Chief, tell your people they just saved 300 lives today. Command out." As the water began to rise in the dry dock, slowly freeing the wounded but now functional Johnston, Chief McAllister looked at his crew. They were battered, bleeding, covered in filth and exhaustion, but they were alive, and they had done it. Petrovsky clapped a hand on O'Malley's shoulder as the young machinist returned, the kid beaming with a mixture of pride, shock, and residual terror. They had done the impossible. They had not just fixed a ship. They had, for one brilliant moment, bent the brutal, unforgiving logic of war to their will. They had been the anvil upon which the hammer of the enemy had fallen with full force, and they had held, unbroken. But as he watched the Johnston being slowly, carefully towed away to safety, McAllister knew in his bones this was not a victory. It was a reprieve, a stay of execution. The real war was still raging on the island just a few miles away, and their part in it was far from over. They had passed the first test, but the next one, he knew with chilling certainty, was already looming on the horizon, waiting for them. The silence was the most shocking sound of all. After days and nights of relentless, ear-splitting gunfire, the constant scream of metal being torn and rebuilt, and the frantic, never-ending chatter of the radio traffic, the sudden quiet felt unnatural, almost oppressive. On the bridge of the Hephaestus, Captain John Wright stared at the final logistics report in his hands, the numbers so staggering they barely seemed real, yet they told a story no newspaper headline would ever carry, no newsreel would ever show. He looked out at the fleet assembled around them. The Johnston was gone now, safely under tow to a rear-area shipyard for permanent repairs, a ghost ship filled with grateful, living men. But in her place were a dozen other success stories, each one a silent testament to the relentless, unglamorous work of his ghost fleet. The repair ships, the tenders, the floating dry docks that never saw combat, but without which combat would be impossible. There was the heavy cruiser USS Birmingham, with a 20-foot gash in her hull from a near-miss 500-pound bomb, now sealed with a patch so precise, so perfectly fitted, it looked like it had been installed in a Norfolk shipyard, not in a floating dry dock under threat of air attack. There were the two destroyers, the Mahan and the Dewey, their superstructures twisted into surreal shapes by kamikaze hits, now standing whole and straight again, their guns functional, their radar arrays turning, their crews saved from what would have been a long, vulnerable, and strategically costly journey back to Pearl Harbor. These ships had not left the fight. They had been kept in the line, their 5-inch guns adding to the relentless, crushing pressure on the Japanese defenders of Saipan, their anti-aircraft batteries helping to protect the vulnerable transport ships, their very presence ensuring the invasion force remained protected and supplied. This was the real, unwritten victory. Not a single dramatic, heroic charge that would be immortalized in films and books, but the cumulative, grinding, inexorable effect of sustained American industrial and logistical power applied at the very tip of the spear. While the Japanese garrison fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they were doomed, they were fighting against a system that could absorb horrific punishment and regenerate itself, on the spot, under fire, again and again. Wright walked slowly down from the bridge to the main workshop deck, the metal grates ringing under his boots. The men were beyond exhausted. They were hollowed out. They slept in shifts next to their machines, in corners, on piles of canvas, in any space they could find. He saw Danny O'Malley, the young Iowa farm boy turned hero machinist, finally asleep slumped over a workbench, his head resting on a stack of grease-stained blueprints, his hands still unconsciously clutching a micrometer, a faint, peaceful smile on his soot-streaked face. He saw Petrovsky, his left arm in a sling from a falling piece of debris during the shelling, his face gaunt with fatigue, but still directing a younger welder on a minor repair to a deck plate, his voice a low, patient rumble. These men, Wright realized with a sudden, profound clarity, were the ones who had truly broken the back of General Saito's brilliant defense, not with bullets or bayonets, but with wrenches and welding torches. They had made the American fleet appear almost supernatural to the enemy, not because it couldn't be hurt, but because when it was hurt, it could heal its wounds with terrifying, demoralizing speed. Later that afternoon, a clean, polished admiral's barge arrived from the flagship. It was the task force commander himself, a man who normally directed battles from charts and radar screens, now coming to this greasy, battered world of repair ships. He didn't assemble the crew for a speech. He didn't want ceremony. Instead, he sought out Chief McAllister, finding him exactly where he knew he would be, elbow deep in the seized guts of a saltwater pump that had failed during the final critical minutes of the Johnston operation, his coveralls stained black with grease and sweat. "Chief," the commander said, his voice uncharacteristically quiet, almost reverent in the noisy machine space. McAllister looked up from the stubborn bearing he was trying to free, wiped his hands on a rag that was already filthier than his hands, and gave his trademark curt nod. "Admiral?" "The Johnston's crew is safe," the admiral began, his eyes taking in the scars on the dry dock's walls, the patched-up sections from the shell hit, the general atmosphere of exhausted triumph. "The ship is stable. They're expecting a full recovery. She'll fight again." He paused, choosing his words carefully. You and your people, you did something out here that changed the fundamental calculus of this battle. He gestured around the cavernous, grimy interior of the ABS-7. We expected to lose ships. Our war plans accounted for it. We never accounted for you saving so many of them, so quickly, right here on the front lines. McAllister grunted, looking back at the disassembled pump with a mechanic's singular focus. Just did our jobs, sir. The Japs broke it. We fixed it. Simple as that. That's the entire point, Chief, the Admiral said, a note of profound, weary respect in his voice. The Japanese fought with incredible, ferocious spirit. They had a brilliant, layered defensive plan. General Saito was no fool. He was one of the best they had. But they couldn't plan for this. He gestured broadly, taking in the ABS-7, the Hercules, the Hephaestus. They couldn't plan for a fleet that simply refuses to stay broken. We won this battle not just because our Marines were brave, and they were incredibly so, but because our mechanics were more stubborn, more resourceful than the enemy's will to destroy. He paused again, his gaze sweeping over the sleeping working men. I'm putting you, Captain Wright, and your key people in for commendations. The Navy Cross, some silver stars, all of you. McAllister finally stopped working and looked the Admiral directly in the eye, his own gaze flat and uncompromising. With respect, sir, you can save the paper. The boys don't need a citation to hang on the wall. They need a hot meal that isn't from a can, a shower with real water pressure, and 8 hours of sleep without someone shooting at them. And I, he said, tapping the broken pump with a wrench, need a new main bearing for this pump before the next operation. That's what we need. The Admiral didn't take offense. He almost smiled, a sad, knowing look in his eyes. He understood these men better than they knew. He reached into his tunic and handed McAllister a single folded piece of paper. This might mean more to them than a medal. It's a communique from Station Hypo at Pearl, a partial translation of a Japanese transmission from Saipan, sent in the last hours of the battle. The source was triangulated to General Saito's own command bunker. McAllister took the paper, his rough, calloused fingers careful with the crisp sheet. He read it slowly, his lips moving slightly, his brow furrowed in concentration. To Imperial General Headquarters. Situation critical. We have fought the American warrior, and we have matched his spirit with our own. But we are not fighting warriors alone. We are fighting against ghosts, against phantoms who descend upon broken steel during the night and make it whole by morning. Our shells find their targets, our planes strike true, but by dawn, the ships are repaired as if by magic. We can kill the warriors, but we cannot kill the machines that return from the grave. We cannot defeat the anvil. McAllister read the message twice. His face, usually an impenetrable mask of grim practicality, softened for a fraction of a second. In that moment, he wasn't seeing words on a page. He was seeing the face of the young welder from Oklahoma who hadn't made it, the empty bunk in Petrovsky's crew, the blood they'd washed off the decks. He carefully refolded the paper along its original creases and handed it back. Don't much care what they think, sir. Just tell us what's next that needs fixin'. The Admiral's smile was thin and held the weight of the entire Pacific War. Okinawa, Chief. They tell me it's going to be the toughest yet. A fortress. As the Admiral's pristine barge pulled away from the oil-stained side of the ABS-7, McAllister turned back to his seized pump. The war hadn't changed. The equation remained the same. Things broke, and men had to fix them. He picked up a twisted, ugly piece of shrapnel from the deck, a souvenir from the Japanese shell that had hit them. He weighed it in his palm, feeling its sharp, jagged edges. His eyes drifted to the empty spot at the welding station where Petrovsky's best man, the kid from Tulsa who could weld anything, had been working before the blast. He clenched the metal in his fist until the sharp edges bit into his calloused palm, a small private pain to remember a larger one. Then he took a deep, shuddering breath, tossed the shrapnel into a scrap bin with a loud final clang, and shouted, his voice echoing with its old familiar roar in the vast, cathedral-like space of the dry dock. "All right, you lot. Stop looking at your navels. The war's not over. We're moving out. Okinawa's waiting, and I won't have you looking like you've been on holiday. Let's get this tub ready to sail. We've got work to do." The crew, jolted from their stupor of exhaustion, began to move. Slowly at first, then with gathering purpose, like a complex machine rumbling back to life. The real story of the Pacific War, the one that truly decided its outcome, was not written in the strategy rooms of Tokyo or Washington. It was written here, in the grease-stained logs of repair ships, in the recalculated trajectories of crane operators, in the sleepless determination of men who understood a fundamental, unshakable truth. The side that can fix its machines fastest, closest to the fight, wins. The unwritten victory, the victory that truly mattered, belonged to the anvil.